German officer Helmut Ritter crouches over the body of an American soldier, inspecting his personal belongings. Among them is a pack of Lucky Strikes, photographs, and letters. The last letter is from 4 days ago, meaning the soldier had been fighting for 48 days without rest. According to all military standards, after 20 to 25 days of constant combat, a soldier's combat effectiveness would break down. They'd tremble, lose focus, and be unable to function. Yet, this soldier fought as if he had just come from a training camp, firing with precision and maintaining his order. Ritter doesn't understand. This soldier is just one example. The Germans had planned their final offensive in the west, Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge, based on the assumption that the Americans were exhausted. After months of fighting from Normandy to the borders of Germany, the Americans were believed to be spent. But when the Germans launched their assault on December 16, 1944, the Americans didn't collapse. They fought back, retreating but holding their positions, losing ground but without panic. Within 10 days, the Germans' strongest push was halted. Why? The key was a system, the rotation system, that the Germans had never understood. This system allowed American soldiers to fight longer, suffer fewer psychological breakdowns, and keep their combat effectiveness high. The Germans viewed their soldiers as expendable. The Americans viewed theirs as resources to be preserved and rotated back to fight when fresh. November 1944, Western Front. German intelligence noted that American units showed remarkable endurance. They weren't just holding positions, but doing so without signs of exhaustion. German divisions typically fought for a few weeks, then rotated back to rest and regroup. But by late 1944, the Germans had no reserves left, and their troops were breaking down mentally. The mental condition of German soldiers deteriorated as combat fatigue set in. Some collapsed under the pressure of constant fighting, while others showed signs of war neurosis, a psychological disorder common in soldiers after prolonged combat. In contrast, the Americans kept fighting, day after day. German officers were confused, unable to understand why the Americans were still able to fight with such resilience. They didn't realize that the Americans had a secret, the rotation system. January 1943, North Africa. The Americans, facing their first major engagement with the German forces, suffered a crushing defeat at the Kasserine Pass. The battle revealed the vulnerability of American soldiers to combat stress. Major Albert Glass, chief psychiatrist of the 2nd Armored Division, treated hundreds of soldiers who arrived at the medical station not with physical wounds but with severe psychological symptoms: trembling, loss of speech, apathy, and inability to respond. The Americans were forced to confront the grim reality. Soldiers who fought the longest were most likely to break down mentally. In just 3 days of combat, the 2nd Armored Division had to treat more soldiers for combat stress than the number wounded in battle. The solution was obvious. Soldiers needed to be rotated out of the front lines before they broke down mentally and physically. July 1943. Sicily. The Allies launched Operation Husky, landing in Sicily and facing intense German resistance. The fighting lasted 38 days, and as expected, the number of combat stress cases skyrocketed. The 1st Infantry Division alone saw 120 cases in the first week, escalating to 680 by the 3rd week. Now, the military had begun implementing rotation. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment devised a plan: rotate 3 companies, each on the front line for 3 days, then off for 3 days to rest. The results were astonishing. The number of psychiatric casualties dropped by half, and the combat effectiveness of the soldiers increased dramatically. General Dwight Eisenhower, impressed by the results, ordered the rotation system to be adopted across all American divisions in Europe. Late 1943. London. Colonel William Menner, a psychiatrist who was consulting on troop morale, carefully studied the data from North Africa and Sicily. He compiled detailed charts to show the mental and physical toll of prolonged combat. Combat effectiveness rose in the first 2 weeks, peaked at 3 to 5 weeks, and then fell sharply after 6 weeks of continuous fighting. By the 8th week, most soldiers were no longer fit for combat. Menner's findings led to the conclusion that soldiers should not remain on the front lines for more than 4 weeks. They needed at least 2 weeks of rest in reserve to maintain their efficiency. Menner and his colleagues set about creating a system to implement rotations across the growing number of divisions in Europe. This was no simple task. By the end of 1943, the U.S. Army had 8 infantry divisions in Europe, but by June 1944, that number would rise to 21. To manage this effectively, they needed a detailed, precise system that could rotate hundreds of thousands of soldiers without disrupting the flow of battle. January 1944. Italy. Anzio. The Allies landed at Anzio in an attempt to outflank the German forces holding the Gustav Line. The battle stalled for 4 months, and rotation became essential. Major General John Lucas, the commander of the U.S. 6th Corps, implemented the rotation system at a division level, rotating regiments every 2 weeks. This allowed for a much-needed relief of soldiers who were starting to break down. The system, however, required precise coordination of artillery, communications, and logistics. Despite the challenges, the rotation system significantly reduced psychiatric casualties. It worked as long as there were enough reserves to rotate in and out. Without proper reserves, the system could break down, but when it functioned properly, it saved countless soldiers from complete mental collapse. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The Allied forces launched the largest amphibious operation in history. The 1st Infantry Division, veterans of North Africa and Sicily, stormed the beaches of Normandy. While the 1st Division fought valiantly at Omaha Beach, they were exhausted from their prior campaigns. They fought for 6 straight days without rest. The situation was dire, and the officers knew that their troops could not hold out much longer. Finally, the 29th Infantry Division, which had been resting, replaced the 16th Regiment, and the soldiers received 3 days of rest. They were able to sleep, eat hot food, and recover from the intense stress of combat. When they returned to the front, they were restored, both mentally and physically. The rotation system, though imperfect under the brutal conditions of Normandy, proved crucial in maintaining the troops' combat effectiveness. August 1944. Paris is liberated. The Allies pushed forward, liberating Paris and advancing rapidly across France. However, the pace was grueling, covering up to 40 kilometers a day. The soldiers, though physically drained, managed to keep fighting thanks to the rotation system. Without the ability to rest and recover, the soldiers would not have been able to maintain the intensity of the campaign. The system kept them fresh, allowing them to continue fighting even as the Germans faltered under the weight of years of war. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The Germans launched their final offensive in the west. Facing 250,000 German soldiers and 1,400 tanks, the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions were rushed to the front, with only 2 weeks of rest. The Germans were veterans, but they were exhausted. The Americans, fresh from their rest, held their ground, though their lines were pushed back. The 99th Infantry Division, despite being green and inexperienced, fought with surprising tenacity, pushing the Germans back and stalling their offensive. January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The Germans had been pushed back, but the cost was high. However, the rotation system had preserved the combat effectiveness of the American soldiers. They had been able to recover and return to the front, while the Germans had exhausted their forces. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders. The war in Europe ended with the surrender of Germany. The U.S. Army had suffered 586,628 casualties, but only 9,293 of these were psychiatric cases. The rotation system had saved thousands of soldiers from breakdowns. Of the soldiers who had mental health issues, 70% returned to duty. In contrast, during World War I, psychiatric casualties accounted for 30 to 40% of all losses. The difference lay in the rotation system. While the Germans used soldiers until they were spent, the Americans treated soldiers as valuable assets, rotating them out to rest and recover before sending them back into battle. This system allowed the Americans to keep their forces fresh and combat-ready, while the Germans' forces were worn thin. The Germans never fully understood the importance of rotation. They saw soldiers as expendable. The Americans saw theirs as valuable and took steps to preserve them. The success of the rotation system wasn't just about preventing mental breakdowns. It was about maintaining the human element in warfare. A soldier who is rotated, rested, and recovered can fight more effectively than one who is pushed to the brink of exhaustion. This was the key to the American victory in World War II.